I was never the kind of person who believed in ghosts, but I was also never the kind to back down from a good dare. This happened about 8 years ago, back when I was still in high school. It was a Friday night, and the small town I lived in didn't offer much beyond urban legends and old places to explore. My best friend Jake and I were bored and decided it would be a good idea to challenge each other to visit the town's cemetery after dark. This wasn't just any cemetery. It was old, with weathered headstones and massive trees whose roots seemed to swallow the graves. Some of the headstones were said to date back to the 19th century, and the place was rumored to be haunted. To us, that was just another excuse to feel a thrill. We got there around 11 p.m., armed with nothing but our phone flashlights. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the sound of crickets and the wind rustling through the leaves. The place was even creepier than I imagined. The headstones were covered in moss, and the engravings were hard to read. The full moon cast just enough light to give everything a silver glow, but it also created shadows that made the place feel even more eerie. Jake, always the joker, started walking among the graves pretending to be a ghost, but I was more focused on not tripping over anything. That's when I noticed a figure moving in the distance, between the headstones. At first, I thought it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. You know how your mind does that when you're already on edge. But as we kept watching, it became clear it was a person, not a shadow. The figure was a man, looking rather unkempt. He had his back to us, crouching near a gravestone and holding what looked like a photograph. He was muttering something, but it was too low to make out. Jake motioned for us to get closer, probably thinking it was another curious explorer like us. I hesitated because there was something off about the way he moved. He kept glancing around quickly, like he was searching for something, but never fully lifted his head. It was almost as if he was talking to the headstones, murmuring names as he moved from one to another. It didn't make sense, but he didn't seem like someone who was just casually visiting. When we took one more step in his direction, the sound of a branch snapping under our feet made him turn toward us. I'll never forget the look he gave us. His eyes were sunken, with dark circles that looked more like stains on his face. He froze for a few seconds, just staring at us, but what struck me the most was the expression on his face. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something between desperation and rage. Suddenly, he yelled something that sounded like a name, but it came out garbled, like his throat was dry. Before we could figure out what was happening, he dropped the photograph on the ground and started running toward us. I didn't think twice. I grabbed Jake's arm and started running as fast as I could. The sound of his footsteps behind us was louder than the pounding of my own heart. We ran through the graves, not daring to look back, trying to find the cemetery's exit. The problem was that everything looked the same in the dark. Headstones appeared out of nowhere, and every wrong turn felt like it pushed us farther from the entrance. The sound of his footsteps behind us didn't stop, but the way he was calling out names was even worse. It wasn't like he was trying to scare us. It was like he was genuinely looking for someone, or something, and that made it even more terrifying. At one point, Jake tripped over a root and almost fell. "Get up!" I hissed through clenched teeth, trying not to shout, but the panic in my voice was obvious. He managed to regain his balance, and we kept running until we finally saw the rusted iron gate that led to the street. When we passed through the gate, the relief lasted only a few seconds. I turned back, expecting to see the man still chasing us, but he had stopped. He was standing right at the cemetery entrance, hands on his knees, breathing heavily. He didn't cross the gate, and that left me feeling uneasy. It was like he couldn't or wouldn't leave the cemetery. Still clutching Jake's arm, I pulled him farther away. We ran for a few more blocks before stopping in front of a 24-hour diner, the only place that felt bright and safe at the time. Our breaths were heavy, and neither of us could speak for a while. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I noticed something on my shoe. The photo the man had been holding was caught in my shoelace. I picked up the photo with trembling hands, sweat dripping down my face. It was an old picture, faded with time, showing a woman with a soft smile, wearing a floral dress that looked like it was from the 70s. Behind her, you could see a grave, but the name on the headstone was blurred, maybe from moisture or just wear. I showed the photo to Jake, but he just shook his head, unsure of what to say. "Do you think it was his wife? Or someone he lost?" he asked, still catching his breath. I couldn't answer. Something about that photo deeply unsettled me, like there was something wrong that I couldn't quite place. I decided to keep it in my pocket, promising myself I'd try to figure out what was going on the next day. We just wanted to get away and forget what had just happened. When I got home, I thought I'd have trouble sleeping, but exhaustion knocked me out as soon as I hit the bed. But the rest didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, like I was being watched. My bedroom window faced the backyard, and the wooden gate rarely made noise. But that night, I could hear it creaking in the wind, slow and unsettling. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but for some reason, I felt an irresistible urge to look out the window. I got up slowly, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. The yard was empty, but the gate was wide open. That was strange because I distinctly remembered locking it before going to bed. I went back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. The next day, the strange feeling lingered. I decided to tell my mom about what had happened, but she just gave me a skeptical smile and said I must have dreamed it. Jake was also shaken. He messaged me early in the morning, saying he couldn't stop thinking about the man in the cemetery. After lunch, we decided to meet at the town library to do some research about the cemetery and hopefully find some clue about the photo I had found. As we flipped through old newspapers, Jake suddenly froze. He called me over with a pale expression, holding a yellowed edition of a local newspaper. "Look at this," he said, pointing to an article from a few months ago. The headline read, "Man disappears after searching for wife in cemetery." My stomach sank. The description in the article matched the man we had seen the night before. The story explained that the man, identified as David, had lost his wife in a car accident years ago and spent nights wandering the cemetery where she was buried, looking for something. But he had mysteriously disappeared months ago, and no one knew what had happened to him. The strangest part was that, according to the article, his wife's grave was in a specific corner of the cemetery, far from where we encountered him. We decided to go back during the day, even though the thought made us uneasy. When we arrived, the cemetery felt far less threatening in the sunlight, but one thing immediately caught our attention. The photograph I had picked up was no longer with me. I could have sworn I'd kept it in my pocket, but it had vanished without explanation. We walked to the area where the newspaper said David's wife was buried. The graves there seemed better maintained, but the atmosphere was still unsettling. We quickly found her headstone, marked with the name Emily, and an inscription that read, "We will meet again, my love." But something about the scene didn't feel right. Fresh flowers lay on the grave, as if someone had placed them there within the past day or two. I looked at Jake, but he seemed just as confused as I was. Who could have left those flowers if David had disappeared months ago? Stranger still, the dirt around the grave looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently. A chill ran down my spine, and Jake suggested we leave. I felt like we were meddling in something we shouldn't. Before we could go, though, something caught my eye. It was the photograph. It was partially buried in the ground near Emily's headstone. I picked it up carefully, and this time I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. In the background of the image, almost imperceptible, was a shadow, a dark silhouette, as if someone were standing behind Emily. My heart raced. "Jake, look at this," I said, showing him the photo. "Did you see this before?" He shook his head, his face filled with pure terror. We didn't say another word. We just left as fast as we could, swearing never to return. In the following days, I tried to forget what happened, but it felt like everything around me kept reminding me. Every fleeting shadow, every creak of the gate at night brought me back to that night in the cemetery. I tried searching for more information about David's case, but every lead ended up being a dead end. No one knew where he was, and the case had gone cold. Jake and I stopped talking about it, as if ignoring it would make it all go away. But the feeling of being watched never really left me. Then, one night, as I was organizing my things, something fell to the floor. It was the photograph. The same photograph we had left at the cemetery. This time, there was something different about it. The shadow in the background looked sharper, almost as if it had moved closer. And even more chilling, Emily's expression in the photo seemed to have changed. The gentle smile now looked strained, almost like a cry for help. That's when I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. I took the photo to the police station, telling them I had found it in the cemetery. They seemed confused but agreed to investigate. They never told me anything about what they found. The photo disappeared again after that, and I chose not to ask. To this day, whenever I pass by the cemetery, I avoid looking inside. I don't know if David is still there, but something tells me he never really left that place, at least not completely. And I've never been able to feel entirely safe again, as if a part of me stayed behind in that night. I've been working as a night security guard at a cemetery for about 5 years. It's not a dream job, but it pays the bills, and the peace of the night shift suited me just fine. I'm not easily scared and actually enjoy solitude, so watching over graves and headstones in silence was never an issue. This happened back in April, on one of those nights where the temperature can't decide whether to cool down or stay warm. It was around 2 a.m. Yi and I was in my makeshift office inside a small guard shack near the main gate. At the time, we were dealing with a lot of trespassers, teenagers jumping the fence to drink or mess around. I usually handled it calmly, but that night was different. Everything started normally, but around 3 a.m., I saw a group sneaking in through the east side where the cameras were broken. I grabbed my flashlight and headed in their direction, ready to give them a warning and send them off, as usual. When I got closer, I realized this wasn't just some typical mischief. There were 4 teenagers, all wearing hoodies, crouched in a circle around an old grave. They had red candles lit around them, and one of them was holding what looked like a small knife. From where I stood, I could hear murmuring, but the words didn't make sense. It wasn't English, maybe Latin. My chest tightened a little. It was all too strange, but I figured it was just some internet trend or prank. Shining my flashlight on them, I yelled for them to knock it off. They jumped as if they'd been electrocuted and bolted in the opposite direction, leaving the candles burning and some items scattered on the ground. I waited until they were gone before moving closer, and what I found near the grave still haunts me. The headstone belonged to a woman named Alice, who had died in 1958. It was one of the oldest graves in the cemetery, with the stone weathered and the name almost unreadable. What caught my attention, though, was what the teenagers had left behind. There was a small pile of items: a dirty rag doll with one arm missing, a Polaroid photo of a couple I didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper with shaky, almost panicked handwriting. My curiosity got the better of me, and I unfolded the paper. It had only one sentence: "The truth is buried, but it still listens." A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just a creepy prank. I gathered everything into a plastic bag, blew out the candles, and headed back to my shack, planning to hand the items over to the cemetery manager in the morning. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The doll, the photo, that cryptic message. There was something unsettling about it all. But things really took a turn on the 3rd night after the incident. One of the groundskeepers came to me in the morning, looking visibly shaken. He said that one of the graves had been disturbed. When we went to check, I saw it was the same grave where the teenagers had been doing their ritual. The soil was overturned as if someone had been digging, but not down to the coffin. It looked more like the dirt had been churned from within. There were no footprints or shovel marks, nothing that pointed to how it had been done. It didn't feel like normal vandalism. I looked around for any other clues, but the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating, like the silence itself was watching me. I decided to stay more vigilant during my next shift. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just my imagination. During the night, I stayed near Alice's grave, watching for any signs that the teenagers might return or that someone else was involved. The hours dragged on, and the silence grew heavier with each passing moment. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing something strange. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was a continuous sound, low and rhythmic, like murmuring coming from the direction of the grave. My flashlight felt weak as I pointed it toward the area, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. I took a deep breath and walked toward the grave, trying to keep my nerves in check. When I got there, everything looked normal, except for one new thing. On top of the headstone was a small cloth bag tied with a thick piece of string. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. When I opened it, I saw it was filled with teeth. Human teeth. They were dirty, some still with bits of flesh attached. My stomach turned, and I nearly dropped the bag. Who had left it there? And why? I locked the bag in the shack, along with the other strange items, and tried to finish my shift without thinking too much. But it was impossible. The murmuring seemed to follow me, echoing in every corner of the cemetery and even inside my own mind. The following night, even though I was off duty, I couldn't stay away. I brought a stronger flashlight and an audio recorder, determined to document anything unusual. I hopped the side gate, just like the teenagers had done, and headed straight for Alice's grave. The silence was oppressive, and that creeping sensation of being watched was stronger than ever. When I reached the grave, I noticed the soil had been disturbed even more. It looked like someone had dug again, deeper this time. My flashlight shook in my hand as I tried to steady my breathing. I turned on the recorder and began walking in slow circles around the grave, hoping to pick up any sounds. It didn't take long for the recorder to catch something my ears couldn't. At first, it was faint, like static, but then it became clearer, a low, mournful wailing that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to rise from beneath the ground itself, growing louder and more desperate. My heart was pounding, but instead of running, I grabbed an old shovel I'd spotted near the groundskeeper's shed earlier that day. I started digging, each shovel full of dirt making the sound intensify. When I struck something solid, I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But curiosity, or maybe something else entirely, pushed me forward. I uncovered what looked like a crude wooden plank, not part of the original coffin, but something placed there recently. I wedged the shovel under the edge of the plank and pried it loose. The wood gave way with a sharp crack, revealing a deep, narrow hole beneath it. A foul stench hit me immediately, so strong it made my eyes water. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness below, but what I could see made my stomach drop. Bones, human bones, were arranged in intricate patterns, forming symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't just piled up. They were deliberately placed, almost ritualistic. As I stared, frozen in shock, the recorder in my pocket began to emit a loud static noise, followed by a piercing scream that didn't sound entirely human. It was a mix of anguish and rage, distorted in a way that made my chest tighten with fear. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind me. But there was nothing. The air felt charged, heavy, like the atmosphere before a violent storm. I turned back to the hole, but I couldn't bring myself to climb down. Something deep inside me screamed that if I went any further, I wouldn't make it out alive. My instincts finally took over, and I began shoveling the dirt back into the hole as fast as I could. The mournful wailing from the recorder faded as I buried the opening, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. I finished covering the hole, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the shovel. I stood there for a moment, staring at the grave, trying to convince myself that it was over. But the cemetery was different now. The silence wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating, almost as if the air itself was watching me, I grabbed the recorder and flashlight, barely able to think straight, and sprinted back to the gate. The moment I stepped outside, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my chest. The world seemed brighter, more real, but my fear didn't leave me. The next morning, I went straight to the cemetery manager, Mark. He was a quiet, no-nonsense kind of guy, the type you wouldn't expect to believe in anything remotely supernatural. But when I told him what I'd seen and played the recording, his face turned pale. He sat silently for a moment, then stood up, walked to his desk, and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without a word, he handed it to me. Inside was cash, not a fortune, but enough to make it clear he wanted me to drop the issue. "Don't dig any deeper, literally or figuratively," he said, his voice flat. "It's not your problem." I quit that job the same day. I didn't even go back to get my things from the guard shack. Whatever was happening in that cemetery, I wanted no part of it. To this day, I don't fully understand what I uncovered that night, but I still have the recorder. Sometimes, when I'm alone and brave enough to listen to the audio, I notice something chilling. The scream grows louder with each playback, as if it's getting closer to me. I've thought about destroying the recorder, but I can't bring myself to do it. A part of me still wants answers, even though I'm terrified of what I might find. Working at a cemetery was never something I imagined myself doing, but back in 2018, I needed the money and accepted the job as a night caretaker at a small cemetery in my hometown. At the time, my life was pretty simple. I lived alone in a rented apartment downtown, spent most of my free time watching shows and playing video games, and only saw my family occasionally. I wasn't scared of the cemetery itself. In fact, I thought it would be a quiet, almost therapeutic job. My shift started at 10 p.m. and lasted until 6 a.m. My only responsibilities were to walk around the grounds a few times and monitor the security cameras from a small control room. Usually, it was just me and the dead silence. That night, everything seemed normal. The clock read around 1 a.m., and I was finishing up reviewing the footage from the last few hours, something I did out of habit, even though nothing interesting ever showed up. Then I heard it for the first time. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me because it sounded so faint and distant. It was a rhythmic sound, like firm knocks on the building's walls. Knock, knock, knock. It paused for a few seconds and then started again. The weird part was that the control room was in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by open grounds. There was no way anyone could knock on the walls without me seeing them through the window or on the cameras. I stood still for a few moments, trying to figure out what could be causing the noise. I looked out the window, but only saw the silent rows of headstones scattered across the grounds, with the shadows of the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Nothing seemed out of place. I decided to check the live camera feeds. The screens showed the usual angles: the empty main gate, the motionless rows of tombstones, and the deserted parking lot. Yet, the knocking continued. Now it was closer, almost as if someone was circling the building and knocking on the walls at regular intervals. My chest tightened. I'm not someone who scares easily, but there was something deeply unsettling about the situation. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to step outside, even though the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I've always been skeptical, so I thought it was probably some kids playing a prank or maybe an animal brushing against the building. When I opened the door, the cold night air hit me like a wall, and the silence was almost suffocating. I walked slowly around the building, shining my flashlight into every corner. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything touching the walls. Just the faint rustling of the leaves in the trees. When I went back inside, a shiver ran down my spine. The moment I shut the door, the knocking started again, this time from the opposite side of the building I had just checked. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but I didn't have the nerve to go back outside. Instead, I went straight to the monitor and reviewed the recordings from the last few minutes. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of one of the screens, near a row of tombstones, there was a figure. I couldn't see their face, but they were wearing a hooded jacket, walking slowly across the grounds. The strangest thing was that, despite the wind, the hood didn't move, as if it was glued to their head. I rewound the footage, trying to make sense of it. None of the gate alarms had gone off, and the cemetery's fences were tall enough to keep out any ordinary person. I decided to call the police. Not because I thought it was something supernatural, but because, honestly, I didn't want to deal with whatever it was alone. While I waited, I kept watching the cameras. The figure would disappear and reappear, always in the darkest, most distant parts of the grounds. Every time they vanished from the screen, I felt a knot in my stomach. For a moment, I thought they were getting closer to the control room, but then I lost sight of them entirely. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation and showed them the footage. They assured me they would do a full search and asked me to stay inside while they checked the grounds. I stayed in the control room, trying to calm down while listening to the officers' footsteps outside. They were talking to each other over their radios, but what unsettled me the most was the absolute silence around the cemetery. After about 15 minutes, one of them came back to the control room to tell me what they had found, and that's when things took an even darker turn. Scattered across the cemetery were several freshly dug shallow holes. They weren't graves. They weren't deep enough for that. Some were smaller, about a foot or two deep, while others looked like they had been abandoned halfway through digging. The officer tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just vandalism, but I could tell even he didn't believe that. When I asked about the person in the footage, he said they hadn't found anyone. No footprints other than their own, no signs of anyone being there that night. I insisted, showing him the recordings again, but he just shook his head and said they'd take the footage back to the station for further review. After another hour of searching, the police decided to leave, telling me to call them again if I saw or heard anything unusual. I was alone again, with the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. Once the officers were gone, the silence felt even heavier. Even with all the lights on in the control room, I felt vulnerable. I decided to review older footage, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. As I went through the recordings from previous nights, something began to disturb me. At different times, usually between midnight and 3 a.m., the same hooded figure appeared in various parts of the cemetery. Always at a distance, always in the darkest areas. Sometimes, they seemed to just stand and stare at the tombstones. Other times, they walked slowly in a straight line, almost as if they were counting steps. The more I watched, the more unsettling details I noticed. The figure never looked directly at the cameras, but in one recording, I saw them crouch near one of the spots where the officers had found a hole. They seemed to dig with their hands, but they never removed anything from the ground. It was as if the sole purpose was to dig the holes and then leave. That realization sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of ritual? A disturbed person trying to scare the caretaker? Or was it something I didn't even want to consider? The rest of the night dragged on, but I knew I wouldn't be able to relax as long as I stayed there alone. Around 4 in the morning, I decided I couldn't just sit there anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and a piece of pipe I found in the storage closet, something to make me feel a little safer, and headed to the area where the figure had been digging in the video. The ground was still disturbed, the soil loose and damp like it had been freshly dug. I crouched down and began poking around, hoping to find some clue as to what this person had been doing. But no matter how much I moved the dirt, there was nothing. No objects, no markings, no explanation. It was just soil, like the act of digging itself was the point. While I was kneeling there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a sound that made my entire body freeze. It wasn't the knocking on the walls this time, but something deeper, almost like a muffled groan coming from far away. I turned my head toward the sound and caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the cemetery near a cluster of trees. My hand trembled as I shone my flashlight in that direction. For a split second, I thought I saw the hood of the figure, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. But before I could react, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back as I stood there, frozen. I couldn't bring myself to stay outside any longer. I rushed back to the control room, locking the door behind me, and immediately checked the cameras. Once again, there was nothing. No sign of movement, no figure, no explanation. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that maybe I was too tired, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I sat back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing, when the monitors suddenly flickered. At first, I thought it was a glitch in the system, but when the feeds came back, all the cameras were pointed at the same thing, the holes scattered across the cemetery. That was impossible. The cameras were fixed in place and could only be adjusted manually, one by one. Yet here they were, all focusing on the disturbed patches of soil. My stomach churned, and I felt a wave of nausea as I stared at the screens. Then I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. In one of the feeds, the hooded figure was back. This time, they weren't walking or digging. They were standing completely still, their back to the camera, facing one of the holes. I couldn't move. I just sat there, watching, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't move. They stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. I sat there, paralyzed, unable to look away from the screen. The figure didn't budge, didn't even twitch. It was as if they were waiting for something. My hands hovered over my phone, debating whether to call the police again. But part of me wondered if it would even make a difference. What could I tell them? That the cameras had somehow moved on their own? That this hooded figure kept appearing and disappearing without a trace? The longer I stared, the more a sinking dread began to fill me, as though whatever was out there wasn't just a person playing pranks. It was something far worse. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, the next the screen went blank for a second, and when it came back, the feed showed only the empty cemetery. I quickly scanned all the camera angles, but it was like they had vanished into thin air. I couldn't stay there anymore. As soon as my shift ended at 6 a.m., I packed up my things and left without looking back. The fresh morning light did little to ease my nerves, and I felt like the eyes of that figure were still on me, even as I walked out of the gates. I took a few days off to process what had happened, though the unease never really left me. During that time, I tried digging into the cemetery's history. I looked for anything that might explain what I saw, but there was nothing unusual. No strange events, no legends, no reports of trespassers. It was just an old cemetery with a long history of silence. I even considered going back to confront my fears and figure out what was happening, but every time I thought about stepping foot in that place again, a cold, irrational terror washed over me. Eventually, I decided to quit the job. I sent in my resignation and never returned. Weeks later, I got a call from a friend who still worked at the cemetery. He told me the holes had started appearing again, fresh ones, in the same shallow, irregular shapes. He said they've increased security, but no one has ever seen who's digging them or why. I haven't told him everything I saw that night. I don't think he'd believe me anyway, but the thought of those holes still haunts me. What were they for? Why were they being dug? And who or what was doing it? I still don't have any answers. All I know is that whatever was out there that night, I hope I never encounter it again. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the knocking in my head, a rhythmic knock, 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 like a warning that whatever it was isn't finished yet. I worked as a part-time caretaker in a small cemetery in the countryside. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me time to study at night. The place was quiet, isolated, surrounded by a forest that seemed to grow denser as the sun went down. It was late October, and the weather was already starting to get colder. Dry leaves covered the stone paths between the graves, crunching underfoot. I didn't have much to do except sweep the paths and make sure no headstones had been damaged. At least, that was the case until that day. That morning, while I was adjusting some flowers that a visitor had dropped, an older woman approached me, visibly uneasy. She said she had heard strange sounds coming from the old mausoleum in the farthest corner of the cemetery. I chuckled awkwardly and tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just the wind or an animal. But she cut me off with a serious look. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like whispers, someone talking inside. I promised to check it out, but honestly didn't give it much thought. That mausoleum had been there for decades, always locked and abandoned. Who would worry about it? After the woman left, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to complain about odd things. The cemetery, after all, already had a naturally eerie vibe. But the way she spoke, as if she truly believed someone was inside, stuck with me. When my shift was almost over, I decided to swing by the mausoleum just to make sure everything was fine. It was a small building, made of dark stone, with carved details that had long been worn away. The letters spelling the family name, Whitaker, were barely legible on the facade. The large iron gate looked intact from a distance, but as I got closer, I noticed it was slightly ajar. That was strange. The mausoleum had a heavy lock that hadn't been opened since I started working there. I pushed the gate slowly, and it creaked with a metallic groan that echoed in the empty space. Inside, the late afternoon light filtered through the cracks in the stone, illuminating dust floating in the air. The interior was empty. No coffins, no urns, nothing. Just a stained marble floor and walls marked where niches had clearly been occupied before. My heart started pounding. I knew I wasn't allowed to mess with anything there, but it didn't take a genius to realize this wasn't normal. I walked out of the mausoleum with a lump in my throat, trying to process what I had just seen. As I locked the gate, I noticed something strange on the ground, marks in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged out. They disappeared into the tall grass surrounding the building. As much as I wanted to investigate, the sun was already setting, and the cemetery had a way of feeling more menacing at night. I decided to report what I'd seen to the manager the next day, but that night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that empty space, as if something was lurking, waiting for me to return. The next day, when I arrived at work, I was greeted by whispers from visitors and suspicious glances. One of the office staff, a woman named Linda, pulled me aside and asked if I'd heard the rumors. According to her, some townspeople were saying they'd seen a strange man wandering the cemetery at night. The description was always the same: a tall figure, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of the 19th century. He never interacted with anyone, just walked slowly, always heading toward the mausoleum. When I asked why no one had warned me before, she shrugged, saying they thought it was just people making up stories. But the coincidence unsettled me. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. During my shifts, I always made a point to check the mausoleum just to see if anything had changed. For a few days, everything seemed normal. No one mentioned sounds or strange figures, and I almost managed to convince myself that maybe the stories were just exaggerations. But then, on a Friday night, I decided to stay a little later to organize some tools in the shed. The cemetery was silent, with that kind of stillness that makes even the smallest noise seem deafening. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like the sound of leaves being dragged by the wind, but there was a rhythm to it. It sounded like footsteps. I dropped everything and went to the shed's window, which offered a partial view of the mausoleum. In the darkness, I saw a silhouette. It was a tall man with broad shoulders and a hat that looked like something out of an old movie. He walked slowly but with purpose and disappeared through the mausoleum's entrance. My blood ran cold. I was absolutely certain no one else was supposed to be there, let alone entering a place that was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the building, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I walked toward the mausoleum, trying not to dwell on what I had just seen. With every step, my heart pounded louder than the crunch of dried leaves beneath my feet. When I finally reached the gate, it was ajar again. This didn't make sense. I had locked it myself days ago, and I knew no one but the manager had the key. I shined my flashlight inside, hesitating to step in. The interior was the same empty space as before, but something felt off. The air was icy, much colder than outside, and there was a strange smell like damp earth and iron. I took one cautious step inside, the creak of the floor echoing like a muffled scream. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something scratching against the marble, like nails or metal being dragged across the walls. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But in the farthest corner, where the light barely reached, I saw movement. It was like a shadow, but it had form. Something almost human, but wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I felt an oppressive weight in the air, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push me out. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps echoed again, this time from outside the mausoleum, growing closer. I turned toward the gate, but no one was there. Survival instinct took over, and I bolted out of the mausoleum without looking back. When I reached the outside, the sound of footsteps stopped, but the surroundings felt even stranger. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the cemetery was shrouded in a darkness that felt thick, almost tangible. I felt like I was being watched. My whole body was tense, and when I glanced back at the mausoleum, the same figure from before was standing in the doorway, staring at me. But this time, something about it seemed different. Like it was just a reflection, a memory, and yet unnervingly real. I couldn't move for what felt like an eternity until the figure took one step forward. That was enough to send me running back to the shed, where I locked the door and stayed until sunrise. I don't know how I managed it, but I spent the rest of the night hiding, clutching a metal rod as if it could protect me from something I couldn't even understand. The next day, I quit. I told the manager what had happened, but he just laughed and said stories about the mausoleum were nothing new. Since then, I've avoided going near that cemetery. Sometimes when I think about it, I can still smell that iron and damp earth. And even though no one believes me, I know something is wrong with that place. Something that was meant to stay locked away forever.